You have 1,400 blog posts on your website, something around that. You've been publishing since you were 17. Essentially, anytime you learn something interesting, think of something interesting, make a realization, you've chronicled it for the world to read and reflect on as well. So what has been an unexpected benefit of essentially publishing everything you've thought or learned your entire adult life?
Yeah, so I think it goes both ways. One of the things that's obviously challenging about having a blog that you started reading when you're 17 is when you're 17, you don't know very much. And I was vaguely aware of that now, and I'm very aware of it at the moment. But even if you're reading a lot of books, you just have no life experience. And so I was writing about a lot of things kind of as I was learning them and as I was applying them to my life. And I think that can be very beneficial to people. So even if I go back and read some of those old articles, although I don't think I have the same breadth of knowledge that I do now, and I would maybe critique some of the things I wrote, there's a kind of earnestness in that I think is beneficial to people who are maybe getting started, because there's this thing that they call the curse of knowledge, which is just once you've learned something and it's become very familiar to you, it's very hard to talk about it or express it in a way that it's new. And so I do appreciate that about my early writing. And I think some people maybe even prefer aspects of my earlier writing because it has that kind of, I just figured this out, and so now I'm applying it. And I think that the major benefit for me is that, this has become it's really hard to even talk about what my life would be like if I had not done this, because it's become my profession. It shaped all of the things that I've done. And so it's really hard for me to separate what it would have been like if I hadn't done this process. So if the person who's listening to this right now is in a similar position, maybe they've just sort of started getting into thinking about productivity or learning or self-improvement, or even just they have some subject they're interested in, starting a blog, starting something like that and writing about it can be really, really powerful. And I think that it's something so powerful just because it forces you to kind of think about and shape your ideas. And so I don't know, I can't even imagine what sort of person I would be if I hadn't spent that much time doing it. It's just so intertwined with who I am today.
Right. And something that you talked about is like when someone's right ahead of you and what they've learned, it's easier to learn from them than it is from somebody who's an expert. So for those years and years that you're 18 years old and writing, it's like, well, the people that were just getting started, we're learning a lot from you then as well. But one of my questions is like, Lewis and I often get the question like, you guys, or the statement, you guys are so early, like you've got this podcast, you're talking to people, and you're the same way. You're 17, you're writing about self-improvement. But one of my questions is like, is there any big thing that you missed back then that you wish that you had planted the seed of in order to start that compound interest that we might be missing as well?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that and it's, again, it's sort of this double-edged thing, that I think I had a certain amount of idealism that I maybe don't have as much now, that I've seen more things in the world and I kind of come to appreciate a more sort of nuanced perspective than I had then. And so some of the things that I was sort of a kind of a believer in, or at least that this was sort of my operating principle, was this kind of extreme power of self-improvement. Basically that like you could do or be anything that you want to be, and that it was just sort of a matter of will. And there's a lot of people that, come out right out and say that very explicitly. And I think from my experience, as I've gotten a bit older, I've kind of become a bit more tempered in that way. So I see now there being, I don't want to say natural limitations, but just that our kind of inherent natures also exert themselves in some ways. And so being kind of aware of that side is important. I also think one of the things that I had as a kind of attitude was I was very interested in entrepreneurship and in the kind of business that I run today. And I still think that there's a lot of value in that. And I was very interested in this idea of just being kind of independent and autonomous. And so that also, I think, caused me to, in some ways, kind of ignore or overlook the importance that, gatekeepers and institutions and these kinds of things have as well. So, I didn't go to the best school that I could have gone to when I was doing my actual undergrad. I know I did this MIT project, but I didn't apply to MIT when I was going there. And so it's really hard for me to be like, well, what's the counterfactual of what my life would have been like if, it could have been, well, it's exactly where I am right now. I think things worked out pretty well for me, so I can't really complain about much. But at the same time, I think that kind of, you could say sort of the more like less romantic details about how the world actually works is something that I kind of came to learn as I got older. But at the same time, when I'm thinking about it, you can, there's a difference between having kind of nuanced wisdom and simply being someone who just accepts the status quo and isn't willing to change it. And so I think sometimes people who are a little bit irrationally idealistic are the ones that actually accomplish big things, because if they knew how the world worked and how much difficulty and inertia and resistance there would be, they might not get started. And so it sometimes requires a little bit of delusion in one's own abilities to shape their own life and to shape the world around them that causes them to take these actions. And so I don't know. Again, I think if I knew what I knew now, maybe I would have said, oh, well, you can't start a blog now because of, this is what's happening in the media ecosystem or something like that. And so I think there's something valuable about kind of a sort of innocence or naivety when it comes to the projects that you're pursuing, because you can just focus on what you want to accomplish and you can focus on this sort of earnestness in pursuing it. And so, people often, that's a question I get asked a lot, is like, well, what advice would I give my 18-year-old self? And I'm not sure I would give any advice, because I think there's probably some things that I know now that I could tell my 18-year-old self, but there's probably some things my 18-year-old self could tell me now that maybe I've lost or I've gotten a little bit less sharp on.